Welcome to the Crook in the Book podcast where three pastor friends usually, we have two today, discuss the Bible and how it connects to life and local church ministry. I am Luke Miller. I'm here with my coworker and friend, Andrew Balich. Today we're going to be discussing Andrew's recent sermon from Acts 14, 1 through 7. So looking forward to that. Let me reread the passage for us, refresh our memories. It says, Acts 14:1, now at Iconium, they, Paul and Barnabas, entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided, some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And there they continued to preach the gospel. All right, before we jump in, listeners, just a reminder, we love to hear from you. If you have questions, topics that you would like to hear us address, we would love to know what those are. So you can go to our website, westwoodcma.org. Click on resources and you'll see a link to the Crook in the Book, and there's a short form you can fill out that we will keep an eye on. All right, Andrew, can you just give us a quick summary of the text? Like, what was the big idea in your sermon Sunday?
Yeah, the main point that I tried to drive home on Sunday was that the gospel spreads triumphant but opposed. It's interesting. It's kind of a short text. We give it a lot of detail in the later on in 14 about Paul and Barnabas in Lystra. And we had a lot of detail from your sermon the week before when they're in city in Antioch. But here in Iconium, it seems to be kind of a condensed version. And what the point that I was trying to make was it's kind of just routine for apostolic ministry. And I think by extension, routine for really all gospel ministry, that the gospel spreads and it's triumphant, and at the same time, it's opposed. You see it throughout Acts, right? This cycle, and we see it in this text. They go into Iconium, and a great number of both Jews and Greeks believe. There's great success. There's victory. Jesus is exalted, and people come to a saving knowledge of him and are converted. And then very quickly, they're opposed as well. And then it's this cycle as they're driven out of Iconium. We find out here in verses 6 and 7 that they go then down to another region there in the larger Galatia area to Lystra and Derbe, and they continue to preach the gospel. So the gospel spreads again, and then will also be opposed. Another way I think I said it that I liked, it captures the same idea, is that victory through suffering is the contour of Christian ministry. The gospel spreads triumphant, opposed. It's victory through suffering. And so I tried to drive that home by splitting the text in two parts, verses 1 through 3, highlighting that this is a different place in the same strategy. All right, different place being Iconium. The strategy is preach the gospel, particularly here, starting with the Jews, and then out from there. And then in 4 through 7, highlighting that it's different people, but the same opposition. All right, they've faced the same opposition here in this new context of Iconium. So the gospel spreads triumphant but opposed, I think, is the big idea for us.
Our listeners will know that you are a bit of a church history fellow, just a little bit. Would you say it's...
dabble.
So you dabble from time to time. Would you say it's safe to say that theme from Acts 14 is also a major theme just in the history of the church from, the end of Acts till now?
I think so. It's kind of the famous saying by the early church father Tertullian was, a lot of people have heard, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, right? You see that. The gospel spreads and it penetrates into new lands, and it is opposed. And as it opposed, it continues to spread like like wildfire. And even coming up to modern day, places where the church is growing most rapidly tends to be those places where it is openly opposed, right? Oppressed and persecuted. It's pretty amazing. I've heard things about Iran right now. The
Yeah.
church is spreading like wildfire. China has been a place where it's spread like crazy as well. I know there's recently, India has traditionally been a pretty open country, but there's been a lot of kind of Hindu nationalism and rising stuff and oppression of the church there, and it's caused the church to grow. Even in places like crazy, like North Korea, in a surveillance state where just the persecution is brutal and just abhorrently wicked, and you can spend your life in jail or even be executed for owning a Bible, that kind of thing. Yet the church spreads. And so really, it seems like in the history that the flip side of that, that's interesting is when the church is not opposed, it often becomes complacent,
Right.
and often declines. And I think we see that in our own country and in many ways, our own denominations. So
yeah, I think it's probably safe to say, hey, if you pick up any biography of a Christian, a faithful Christian you've heard of, I've not read that many, but all the ones that I've picked up, there's been a huge theme of this, of any way the Lord used them, any victory of the gospel through them, it was always mixed with some serious form of persecution, whether it was, physical or verbal or whatever. I had an illustration from my sermon in the previous passage from George Whitefield. I spent some time with Dallin Moore's biography of him last year. I'd never read any of that. And man, you could tell so many stories, but the one that always stands out to me is he had dead cats thrown at him, just because that's just like crazy that actually happened to someone. But that's a theme of his life, is God used him, man, so much incredible revival in some of the most unlikely of places, but always, pretty much without exception, there was somebody standing up and seeking to oppose the work. And it made me think of your conclusion Sunday. I mean, I thought that was a great tie-in to Paul's words to Timothy: all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution.
Yeah. It's the norm. You should ask yourself, if you're not experiencing any resistance, persecution looks different in our context, and that's okay. We're not supposed to seek out trouble, right? But if there's no even resistance to you in your life, it begs the question: are you really seeking to Paul's point, live a godly life?
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable question to ask, but it's important to ask that, I think. I thought it was interesting on another note. Back in verse 1, there's that phrase that says that they spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Gentiles believed. And you highlighted on Sunday, God, of course, sovereignly uses means, and all the glory goes to him, but he does use us. And he seemed to use the way in which Paul and Barnabas shared the gospel on this particular occasion. And we're not given great detail what that looked like, but it did make me wonder, as we've gone through Acts, I don't know, have any pointers regarding the way in which we share the gospel stood out to you? Maybe ways that are helpful versus ways that are unhelpful.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me is how diverse, I guess, the ways that the gospel is communicated, or the way the preaching goes in Acts. It's highly contextualized, you could say. Mm-hmm. The core message, of course, is the same.
Right.
Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Right. But when Paul is speaking to the Jews in the synagogues, it's a lot of Old Testament. Peter was as well in his preaching, of course, in Jerusalem and Judea. There's a lot of promise and fulfillment because the audience would be familiar with the Old Testament scriptures, right? This is getting ahead of us, but it's fresh on my mind and thinking about this coming week when Paul is in Lystra. There seems to not be a Jewish community, so he doesn't start in the synagogue. We actually find him preaching in the street to Gentiles. And when he is preaching and trying to get them to stop making sacrifices to them as gods and all of that, he doesn't go to the Old Testament and talk about the Messiah. In fact, he starts by establishing monotheism. Basically, for these pagans that are idolaters, if he went straight to Jesus, they wouldn't have any trouble with that, but they might just think Jesus is another god to add to the pantheon, right? But it's not that at all. First, he has to establish the God, the one God who made the heavens and the earth and the common grace and the general revelation before he can get to Jesus and the gospel. And so you see the context there different. You'll find places where the preaching and the confrontation is very kind of harsh. You remember back a few weeks ago with Bar Jesus, he's holding pulling no punches in his confrontation there in the context of telling the proconsul there about Jesus. And so you see that highly situational, I guess, and I think that's really instructive to us. The gospel, sharing the gospel is going to look different depending on who you're talking to and the context and where you're given the opportunity to speak, both in tone at times and in content.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful. I think, honestly, if we just keep those two things in mind, what is the background, the kind of knowledge of religious things of the person or persons I'm talking to, and then also what seems to be their attitude. You have to be slow, of course, to judge this. You don't want to jump to the conclusion that, some initial resistance means they're just adamantly going to oppose every word you say. But being aware of, okay, is this, in Paul's case, that guy was like an enemy of the gospel, seeking to prevent someone else from turning to Christ. So great was his opposition. But anyway, I think keeping those two concepts in mind is really helpful. And I think we do that somewhat naturally, probably just kind of instinctually, but being aware of that is big. I'm not going to probably start in the same place with someone who hasn't grown up in church versus someone who did grow up in a church that preached the Bible.
Makes a big difference.
Or, someone who did grow up in church, but maybe it was a heretical church where it was all prosperity gospel. That also affects the way in which I'm going to approach things. So, I think that's important. Kind of on a similar note, there are times where, sadly, a door for ministry may close for various reasons. And again, we don't want to give up on this too quickly, but those times do come. The previous passage, they shake the dust off their feet when they are rejected adamantly by the Jewish leaders, Jewish people of the synagogue. In this passage, they become aware towards the end that there is a lot of, plotting against them, against their lives. They learn of it. In verse 6, they flee to a different place. How do you know when a door for ministry or evangelism is closing? We can be too quick to assume this, but sometimes maybe we hang around too long. What other thoughts do you have for us on recognizing open versus closed doors?
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind just as instructive from this passage is it wasn't just because it was a difficult place that they ended up moving on. That in fact, it says in verse 3, it's interesting. I think I highlighted this. When the Gentile or the Jews are stirring up the Gentiles and poisoning their minds against the brothers, it's for that reason, verse 3. So it says, because of this, Paul and Barnabas remain for a long time, speaking boldly. I think that's helpful because a door is not closed just because it's hard to walk through. A door is closed when something else happens. And in this case, in this passage, it's when, if they stay, they're literally going to lose their lives. And I think it's most of us are not going to find ourselves with the options quite so stark as that, probably. So I think there's a difference between difficulty and open hostility. I don't know about you, but there's been people in my life that because of my Christian witness, or because of my testimony and wanting to share the gospel, they just don't want to have anything to do with me, you know? Or sometimes this is even harder when it's a family member. My biological grandfather that's not been a big part of my life, but I've connected with over the last few years. He's Baha'i, actually. And if you don't know if you know anything about Baha'i, but it's like, all roads lead to heaven kind of thing. Just choose your path and be faithful to it, and you'll make it in the end. Kind of this universal pluralistic kind of thing. And I've had some real heart to heart conversations with him with not a whole lot to lose, like let me just give it to you thick, lay it on thick and make it plain. And there's been times when he's been very much shut the conversation down and said, no, I'm not going to read the Gospel of John with you. I don't want to talk about that. I think you're wrong on this, and the door really is closed. It's just no longer fruitful. I mean, I could, I guess, shout over him, I guess I could impose myself, but the door's closed there. And thankfully in that case, there's been follow-up conversations and he's softened again, but I think the doors can close and open at times. But I think maybe that difference between difficulty and hostility, is maybe a helpful distinction to think about. When it becomes hostile, it really becomes unfruitful. And I think one of the things to keep in mind too of this is, and it's instructive from this passage, that they don't run into the closed door and then throw their hands up and stop preaching the gospel. They turn their attention elsewhere and continue to preach the gospel. So running into a dead end with somebody, some relationship or some ministry context, doesn't mean you're free to just stop. It means that you're free to pivot or redirect your attention to investment elsewhere. And I think it's a helpful reminder as well. And it's freeing, at the same time. So,
yeah, I think it's interesting as well, back to your point on verse 2, them staying because people's minds are being poisoned. I could say a big part of why they stayed, even though it was hard, is because they had such an overwhelming concern for those new believers or potential believers. They wanted to counteract the negative and false messaging that was being put in people's brains. And so, as always in the Christian life, right, love needs to be our motive, whether it be love that enables us to stay when it's really hard and when people are pushing against us, or love that goes to another place where people need the gospel when the door is closed. But it sure seems like, if we can avoid those two extremes, we'll be off to a good start. The extreme of thinking just because it's hard and someone was mean and, got mad, I'm done right away. But also the other extreme of I've been beating my head against a brick wall, so to speak, for quite a while now, and this person is just not open. We want to avoid both of those things.
Well, and it comes like the relational capital you have with somebody too. I think it's just not a one size fits all. If you're related to somebody that's really tough and even is kind of hostile and closed off, that doesn't mean you just can walk away from the relationship. Where these become particularly acute is when you find yourself married to someone who is not a believer. What is that? You can't just in good conscience walk away from that relationship, right? The Bible actually forbids it if they're willing to stay married to you as a believer. But parents and children and even longtime friends, that somebody you've invested decades in with a relationship, just because they won't respond to the gospel doesn't mean you or even hostile to your faith doesn't mean you just wipe your hands of the relationship. Whereas somebody with a lot less investment and relational kind of capital there, maybe you do move on to places that have more opportunity. So I think it is a case by case basis for sure.
It is case by case. I think it is safe to say, though, as much, especially with family that God has sovereignly placed us in, but in other relationships too. I think as much as we can keep the relationship open, and that's not always possible, but as much as we can keep that relationship open, that's good. Even if gospel conversations don't happen for a little while because of how closed off they are, if we can keep the relationship there, you just don't know what the Lord may do down the road.
Yeah.
In that case.
Well, and this is getting kind of off the original question, but I think of with people that you have a long history with, especially family, they need to know where you stand and what you believe. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that every conversation with them has to be a gospel presentation or confrontation. You know what I mean? I've had people like that in my life that have been a part of my immediate family, where I've pushed through difficulty to the point when it became hostile. It's like, well, if I keep pushing, then there's going to be no relationship left. So, well, to your point, let's leave the relational door open and see what God does. They understand the gospel. They know the gospel. They're not submitting to Christ in this moment. Better to be there when crisis strikes or the Lord humbles or chastises, right? Better to be there and be a presence for the Lord in whatever the future brings than shutting the door yourself. Yeah. There's a difference between the door being shut and you shutting it.
Yes. I guess. Yes, that's well said.
And I think sometimes in our zealousness, we can kind of shut the door, even with like a gospel presentation motive. We can drive people away that we could maintain a relationship with.
It kind of takes us back to our first point again, being aware of our audience, even if that audience is someone you know really well. That is a helpful way to inform the way in which you present the unchanging truth and the times at which you do so. Let's talk for a minute, though, about why people find the gospel upsetting in the first place, because it should strike us as a strange thing, but at the same time, it shouldn't if we know our Bibles and what the Bible says about our human hearts. You pointed out verse 3, they were bearing witness to the word of his grace. You pointed out that grace is the thing that seems to really infuriate opposers to the gospel. Why is that? At first glance, it would seem like grace, right? The free offer.
Yeah, we all love it.
Christ.
What's wrong with it? Yeah.
Like, why would we have a problem with that? What would you say?
I think it just runs so counter to our own self-righteousness and evaluation of ourselves when we're in our sin. You know, we want to be able to do something to earn God's favor or not do something to be in right relationship with God. Or I think in a lot of cases for the Jews, it was coupled with in this passage, and when there's been opposition from the Jews, also who they are. Like, what do you mean we need to do something different or believe something different than we always have? We're the Jews. We're the chosen people, right? So it's not what group you're a part of or how you identify. It's not that you're better than somebody else. You know, it's not a comparison thing. But grace says that it has nothing to do with you, who you are, what you've done, what you don't currently do, right? It is what Christ has done. And that is, by necessity, puts us in a place of absolute helplessness and need for mercy. And we don't like that. We don't like to feel helpless and totally dependent on someone else, even when that someone else is God. But the beautiful thing, and the reason why it was so divisive in this passage, is because while there's those who hate it and it makes them angry because it tears down their self-righteousness, it's such a blessing and a breath of fresh air and brings freedom and joy to others that you have these two opposed groups of those who believe the message of the gospel and those who don't. But if the gospel is clear, is what I was trying to say on Sunday, when the gospel is clear, it will be divisive. Yeah, we can muddy it and we can have so many qualifications and things so that it's not offensive. But the gospel really is offensive when it's clear. for the reasons that we just said. And so
Yeah.
be clear on the gospel and let the chips fall. And what we learn in Acts and we learn in this passage is that many will respond positively to it. But there will be the opposite side of that triumph piece, right? Which is the opposition.
Yeah. I've been reading Galatians in my devotions lately, which of course Paul writes to the churches of this region he's in later on.
Yeah.
And I was struck today in chapter 6. I can't remember the verse, but he's kind of making his final appeal to them in that last chapter again, and circling back to some themes. And he says, those who would have you circumcise, and more broadly, those who would have you, keep the law of Moses as a way of earning God's favor. It says they want to make a good showing in the flesh. The motives behind the people who are trying to indoctrinate you to salvation by works rather than by grace, really they're out to look good. And like you said, to feed their pride. And grace does the opposite. It humbles us. And there's another theme of Galatians. There's wonderful freedom in that. It's much better than anything our human pride could offer that. But our pride has to die. And that's why we don't like it, apart from God moving on our hearts. Yeah. Well, good discussion, brother. Listeners, again, if you have questions regarding this today, anything that came out of this discussion or just other things that come to mind, go to our website, resources, Crook in the Book. Feel free to submit them. I'll leave us here with one more question, though. I don't know if you know this, Andrew, but America is turning 250 years old this year, this July the 4th. So that's coming up.
Big deal. What's the big fancy word for that? Is it like the semi-sesquicentennial or so? I can't remember, but there's some big long word for that in Latin. I'm assuming for
one of our listeners can tell us on Sunday when they see us, because I can't remember. I've heard it too, but I started reading last night David McCullough's 1776, which I've always heard is amazing, but I've never read it. So it was on sale on Amazon, so I bought it. It was an early Father's Day gift to myself. I started that
nice.
last night. But that made me wonder, do you have a favorite American history themed movie, TV show, book, documentary? And let's just say like broadly, like anything to do with American history. It doesn't have to just be 1776. Is there a favorite show or book of yours that comes to mind?
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, my favorite movie from American history is The Patriot, which is 1776, right? Is the Revolutionary War period. Aim small, miss small, Mel Gibson says, to his sons before they take on the redcoats. I like, that's one of my favorite movies of all time. So I would say that one of my, on the Revolution specifically, the work of Gordon S. Wood is his name. He actually just died, passed away. He was an older gentleman, emeritus professor at, I can't remember where. But you never know how a life is going to end. He was actually hit in the parking lot of a grocery store and like in his late 80s and passed. This this guy who's very well known for his American history. But he has like a popular level book called, I think the title is The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which is really good. I was introduced to his stuff back in American history course in college and kind of found out later how big of a deal Gordon Wood is in American history. So his stuff on the Revolution is really good.
There you go.
Another one that I really like from a theological perspective is Thomas Kidd's work. He does a lot on the faith of the founding fathers. He has like a religious biography of Thomas Jefferson. He's done stuff on Patrick Henry and Ben Franklin. He's written a lot on the Great Awakenings and stuff. So if you like the more of a theological lens, Thomas Kidd is really good as well.
Awesome. I have not seen The Patriot ever, and I'm actually hoping to watch it this 4th of July season.
On July 4th?
Seems like
on the day?
I think I might watch it on the day.
On the day.
Just go for it entirely. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you learned some good American history resources, but also, more importantly, some helpful discussion on our passage from last Sunday. But thanks for joining us. Our music, as always, is from Gregory Allen Isakov. Our producer is no longer Tommy Busius. Thank you, Tommy Busius, for your years of faithful service.
Yes.
Grace and peace to you. The producer now is, well, probably Jeremy Muncie at some point. So thank you for that, Jeremy. We'll see you next time, and God bless.